So DealQuest listeners, I am so excited to have Michael Vann on an upcoming episode of DealQuest. Just a huge amount of experience in M&A, succession, et cetera. So Michael, tell me a little bit about yourself and what we're going to hear on your episode of DealQuest.
Great. So we're a strategic consulting and transaction advisor, and we work with small, mid-sized companies on, executing their strategies and planning their exits. And what we're going to talk about in our conversation is what's going on in the current M&A market, some of the challenges and obstacles that we see with internal succession, and some lessons to learn about when you do go do a deal that you should be prepared to address, like having the right attorney.
And not only that, but I'm sure that'll come up. And I know we mentioned, you're an expert on in a lot of this areas, but you do have a book, right, out on internal succession side. What's the name of the book?
Buying Out the Boss, The Successor's Guide to Succession Plan, which is written from the perspective of the buyer rather than the seller.
There we go. So hear a little bit more about that. So look out for Michael Vann's episode on the DealQuest podcast. Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On the show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions to smaller deals that you can do even without significant capital. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the DealQuest podcast. Let's get started. Michael Vann is the president of the Vann Group, a strategic consulting and transactional advisory firm that works with owners and leadership teams and privately held and mid-sized businesses. His areas of expertise include strategic facilitation, succession, transition planning, mergers and acquisitions. The internal ownership transition expert, he serves as a trusted advisor to owners of companies who value his practical and personable approach and his ability to simplify complex business issues into an actionable plan. He has successfully advised companies in a variety of industries, including professional and technical services, insurance and financial services, construction, industrial services, manufacturing, and food and hospitality. Michael, along with his father, Kevin, is the co-author of Buying Out the Boss, The Successor's Guide to Succession Planning, which looks at succession and transition planning from the perspective of the internal acquirer. He is a frequent guest speaker on topics such as value building, succession, transition planning, and selling a business. Welcome, Michael Vann, to the DealQuest podcast.
Hey, Corey, thanks for having me.
Listen, it's great to have you on. I'm so excited about the topic we're going to talk about. We've got a lot we can talk about, M&A in general, it's succession planning, which I know we're going to focus on a bit. And listeners, if you are really interested in especially the succession planning portion of what we'll talk about today, and you want to go back to episode 88, where I did a solo cast, where I also talked about internal succession. You can supplement the wisdom Michael gives with some things that I put on that solo cast. But Michael, before we get into all of that, I want to take you back to when you were growing up as a little kid, maybe 8, 10, 12 years old. What did you want to be? Because my guess is a consultant and a banker, and doing M&A and succession probably wasn't it at that time, but you tell me.
It wasn't, but at some level it was. So I always wanted to be a baseball player, right? Pitch for the Red Sox because I'm from the Boston area, and I'm a left-hander, so I figured that would be a natural fit for me, except for the lack of talent.
Right. One minor missing, right?
One minor problem with that. But the other one is I always, I was a big Family Ties fan and loved Alex B. Keaton. So there was always this background of business, and I grew up in a very entrepreneur family. My father has owned a number of businesses, and so I always kind of had the bug for business. I didn't quite grasp, the M&A side of it at the time, but certainly loved the concept of being in business and doing deals and, being a part of that culture.
I love it. So talking about, having that mindset then and doing deals, what was your first deal of any type, whatever comes to mind?
Oh, God, I think when I first started a career, I sold a coffee shop. That was like the first big deal that I did. It was a coffee shop, and it was they had a roasting operation with it as well.
Love it.
It was funny. I looked at it and I was like, God, why am I not buying this thing? Because back in those days, they used to print money. But that was like my first good deal that I did when I first got started.
Love it. Yeah, and then that space got a bit saturated over time, right? Great stuff. So, all right. So we talked about it a little bit in your bio, but just, give us just a few more sentences on, exactly, what you do for clients. I know the internal succession's a part of it, but you also do external M&A deals, right?
Yes, we do. We kind of, our business falls on, we've got like three-legged stool, right? So one leg of the stool is the succession and transition planning piece, both, the internal transaction side as well as, the contemplation of what an overall exit's going to look like, and it's going to be external or internal, and we're just going to liquidate. Our second stool is we do a lot of strategy and leadership development work for growth companies. That's a lot of fun, and it helps us with the kind of positioning of these companies for sale in the long term. And then we have our, both buy side and sell side on the M&A side. So we really try to provide our clients with a full life cycle of support, regardless of where they are in that cycle.
So let's start, just because I did a recent solo cast, even more so because you and your father are published authors on this topic. Let's start on the internal succession conversation. And I know, in the bio, we talked about, that you said that the book is from the point of view of the internal successor, right? The buyer. Tell us about some of the, for me, in my experience, because we do a lot of it as well, there's some really interesting conversations around, first of all, just how you do it in general, but like the planning that it takes, determining who is the right successor. Do you have one? How do you structure that deal? Are you better off doing an external deal? Do you have to discount, valuation on an internal deal? Some, I know I'm throwing a lot out here, but I just want to, you can pick any of these. I know in some industries, there's a conversation about, well, why would I sell internally? Because a lot of times I got to self-finance that, and I might as well keep my cash flow going out. Questions about can the next gen, whether it's family or non-family, really run and take over the business. There's a lot that comes up in internal succession. Then there are a lot of positives, right? They know the business, they may know the clients, there's continuity, et cetera. From your point of view, what are the biggest things that come up in terms of opportunities and challenges and, in prepping for an internal succession?
I think at some level you nail them all, because there are so many moving pieces to an internal transaction that it's a lot of fun. Like, you never know what you're going to get into when you start them. And, as coming from a family business and being a second generation, I just kind of have this desire to see that companies, have that continuity if possible, whether it's a family member or employee or, group of employees that able to keep that company, because there's such a lifeblood to our communities. If you look at most companies in the organizations, that's the locally owned companies that are the ones contributing to, the nonprofits in the area and are engaged. And when they come in and they get bought by private equity or by a strategic, you kind of lose that in the community. So to me, that ability to keep these companies locally owned is just a great story, both for the company and for the community. So that's why we're kind of fascinated with those. And plus, from a purely like philosophical standpoint, they're just so much fun to work on, because there are so many moving parts to it that no two are the same.
Yeah. How does a single founder or multiple founders who are looking how do they evaluate whether they have the right people in place, and, and what are the concerns also on the buying side?
Yeah, I think, the problem is they don't do a very good job of assessing that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there was a stat, I think, that Mass Mutual or something had published in a study years ago that said something like 50% or 60% of founders didn't believe that their successor was prepared. Mm-hmm. A lot of founders don't put that level of effort into making sure that they have a successor in place, which I think is part of the challenge when we come in and it's like, okay, we don't have a management team, we don't have a successor, so we have to build that for them and help them do that. So that's definitely a challenging piece for them to deal with. I think the other side of it with the internal succession that's hard is that the buyer, I guess if we're going to call them that, or the interested party, really has no clue what they're doing when they start this process. Right. Some of them come in with an inkling that they want to buy the business. Others have been approached out of the blue. And so they're really they have no clear idea what it takes. So they're incredible disadvantage when the process starts.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting to me is that, usually, and this is a generalization, but, usually the founders are entrepreneurs, quote unquote, right? They've started something from scratch, and internal, if you're talking about existing people, they're employees. And I have no judgment, on one or the other, but it is a different mentality, and the ability of, employees to turn into owners, and whether it's taking on the risk or being the buck stops with you, that kind of thing. It's an interesting transition, right?
It is. And I think it's one of the, if I call it a criticism of like the ESOP space, and a lot of that is they push the employee ownership as being this end all be all. But as we know, most employees are employees for reasons.
Right.
So when that mindset comes out, oh, this is great for your employees and things like that, an owner kind of gets obsessed with it, that they're doing the right thing for the employees by giving them this opportunity to do this. And they don't understand why the employees don't have a lot of interest in it when it comes up, because who wouldn't want to own their own business if you're a business owner? So that, I think, is really hard when you're dealing with employees. I think another stat we had, I think it was like only like 6% of all transitions are to an employee. So it's a really small amount.
Right.
Because they are employees at their nature. They're comfortable with that level of risk.
That's right. So what are some of the ways, you don't necessarily, you can still do an internal transition if it's not to an existing employee. You talked about, building a management team. At some point they're existing employees, but, you might be able to bring in new folks who are more inclined to take it over, or bring in somebody who's outside who becomes a partner and then you take it over. Talk about some of those options where maybe you don't have the right employees in place who run the business, but if you're smart enough in advance, you start to build, people who can actually take over.
Yeah. And I think that's when we talk to those owners. If we can catch an owner who's 3 to 5 years out on a succession,
right?
That gives us time to start to position it, whether we're going to bring in someone from the outside who's going to be able to fill those shoes, or if we can start to build and grow that leadership team. I was just on the phone last week with one of our clients who were selling, and we've got a good offer from a private equity group, and he said to me, the biggest mistake is I never replaced myself,
right?
Because it was creating issues with the deal right now. And I think a lot of owners, don't realize that at the time because they don't want to give up the control. They don't spend the money and don't see the big picture of it. But, making sure that the business can run without you is, should be like priority number one for a business owner.
Yeah, the powerful part about that is that, as you illustrated there, if you do that successfully where it can run without you, there's more chance your internal folks could take over, but you're also more attracted to an external buyer.
Yes. Oh, no doubt. Because they, particularly if you're looking now more of those equity types or even the search funders and those guys, they don't necessarily want to come in and be running the day-to-day side of the business. They want to be, dealing with the strategic side of it. So the more stability in the management team, the better you have of a chance of getting a sale completed.
I find, and it sounds like you may as well, you can confirm or disagree. I think, it's so... In the entrepreneurial world, Entrepreneurs Organization, I was a member for many, many years. And around the Yale community, as many entrepreneurial communities, there's always this talk about, working on your business, not in your business, creating business that runs without you, Michael Gerber, the E-Myth. And a lot of that's, discussed in the context of just, being able to do that and having to be scalable. But I don't know that people really tie it into the difference in enterprise value and exit value that you can create as closely as it really does, tie in the real world.
I don't think they do. And that's why when we have those conversations with owners, particularly the ones who are maybe 5 or 10 years out, we talk about in the context of building value versus scale.
Yeah.
I hate to say that anyone can scale because it's certainly not easy, but it's certainly harder to build long-term value. So if you focus on that and think about it from that standpoint, that it gives you more options on an exit. Maybe you're going to hold the business for the next generation. That's an option if you've been focused on building value versus just trying to build scale for a quick sale.
Yeah. So it totally makes sense to me that in addition to your internal succession, work and experience and your buy side and sell side M&A experience, that you have this consulting piece of what you do, leadership consulting, because, that's crucial to everything we were just talking about.
Definitely. And, the size companies that we deal with, which are your typical $500,000 to $5 million EBITDA companies, they're typically privately owned, second, maybe even third generation most of the time. So they haven't thought about that thinking. They just know this is what they do.
Right.
So now to kind of flip that hat and say, oh yeah, we want to build value. We want to have something tangible here that is going to be saleable or is going to be able to pass on to the next generation. There's a certain owner or mindset that comes with that we like to work with because they get it, from a big picture standpoint.
So let's talk about, you mentioned second, third generation companies. The statistics on success, on family businesses get dismal as you go down the line, right? Second generation does okay, although some of them squander it, but the statistics aren't terrible. You jump to third generation, they drop a lot, and it continues from there. What's been your experience, and why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think the indication is we've done well with second generation in affecting that transaction and keeping second generation vibrant in companies. I think with third generation and definitely with fourth, there's just such a drop off from the experience side of it.
Yeah.
If the business has lasted that long, it's clearly been a successful business in the past. In the next generation, I don't know if it's in a level of entitlement or if it's they're in it because it's more of an obligation
Yeah.
than a passion for the business. Whereas the second generation, if they're in there, they're typically there because, they grew up in the business and they love the business.
Right.
Third generation and fourth generation don't see that as much.
Yeah, it's interesting, and obviously things are changing in terms of gender and things like that. But the stereotypical son working under the old man founder, just has been groomed from the minute, and directly instilled with the values and the approach or whatever from the father, and it just gets diluted from there. Plus, also in my mind, it's also a numbers game, right? One of the practical problems that you end up with is that each next level of generation gets exponentially bigger, right? Assuming that people have more than one kid, which most people do, right? So that's another problem that I see is that just the math gets crazy. I mean, I've got some clients where, there were like 16 members of the family that own pieces of it. And then, some people work in it and not, and it causes all kinds of drama. There's just so many more issues.
We had that problem with the fourth generation business. And the way it was, I think there was, I'm trying to remember now, it was like 16 or 17 different individual shareholders. And the second generation built the governance and the ownership transition, with the concept that everyone is going to get along and love each other and want to be in business together. And it was just such an absolute mess because they were basically three different families within this initial thing, and they each owned a third of the company, and you could only sell the shares within your third. And they would, the one group that was completely inactive in the business would horse trade to get what, with the other ones to get what they wanted, so they could get they squandered the business by the time we got to the fourth generation. We were called in to try to see if we could save it. It was just impossible. They were at the point where they would rather inflict pain on themselves if it meant inflicting pain on the other side. They'd rather lose than let the other side get a win. So
yeah, boy, and doesn't that? I've obviously come across this as well. And then as a lawyer in my case, or as an advisor, consultant, investment banker in your case, you end up trying to play psychologist, a psychiatrist, right? Which we're not trained for, or at least counselor. And sometimes, it's just impossible. I mean, I've seen it. I've got a client where, it's amazing. They operate successful. They have 7 or 8 companies, and the company's successful, and it's so dysfunctional. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, how much more successful could they be if they're this successful, totally dysfunctional? Like how much more successful could they be if they actually, functioned? It's amazing.
Got some great stories over the years from seeing some of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure. I remember one other story. I grew up in New York, and there was a big sporting goods store, which anybody in New York knows, called Paragon. There was a time when you would have to pay for whatever you bought on the first floor of the store. And then if you also bought stuff on the second floor, you'd have to pay for that at separate registers on the second floor. And everybody was confused why. And the reason was because it was 2 brothers who owned the store, couldn't get along. And the way they split it was they split the floors of the store. and they were running as separate businesses for a while. So it's crazy. Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can invite you to a new way to determine your deal readiness. I created a fast and easy assessment that will determine exactly how deal ready you are. Once you complete the assessment, I use your responses to identify the obstacles that are holding you back from being a deal-driven growth genius. It's as easy as heading to CoreyKupfer.com/assessment. That's CoreyKupfer.com/assessment and filling out a few multiple choice questions. I'll be checking in after the episode to see what your results are. Now back to the show. All right, so let's start talking about now the M&A market, more external deals. Talk to us about some of the industries where you're seeing the most activity. What are you seeing out there? I know in a lot of industries we've seen, there's a lot of money out there. Talk about what you're seeing in terms of availability of capital, in terms of level, frequency of deals, in terms of impact of recent events like COVID and whatever. What are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When COVID hit, I think we had like 3 deals that were either under LOI, in purchase and sell, or about to go into one of the 2. And it just like, boom, stopped.
Right.
Everything shut. We didn't hear anything from anybody. Basically one of those deals is going forward. The other two died. That one should hopefully close next week. But then around May, we started to kind of see this resurgence of activity where the buyers started popping up again to see what we had for inventory, what was going on. And suddenly we saw this acceleration of activity from sellers. We've got like a great inventory of companies right now that are either on market or about to go. And if you had asked me that was going to happen in April, May, I would have said no way. But I think what you're seeing is that a lot of business owners are saying, I was going to give this a couple more years, but after dealing with this, I don't want to deal with it. So let's accelerate that process.
It's so interesting to me how this happens in every cycle, right? Where when valuations are at the top, right? And by the way, we never know exactly when the top is, right? But, in hindsight, at least when valuations are at the top, a lot of people will get out because it's good times, right? And then, some adversity comes and things drop, finances drop, or the economy looks tough. And somebody's in their 60s or whatever it is, right? And they look and they say, you know what, do I want to go through another down cycle and come back up and have to be in this thing 5+ years, more, and then they sell and they end up a lot of times. I mean, although this time's a little weird because it was such a dip and then come back, so I'd be curious to what you're seeing on valuation. But in general, they leave some money on the table because they get out when things are on the downside.
Yeah. I mean, from a valuation, it's still early. I mean, I've read the studies and stuff that AMAA has put out and a couple others. They're showing valuations down 20-25% or something. We haven't seen it yet. We have one deal that went on, we're negotiating the LOI right now, and the multiple is right in line with where we expected it to be when we took it to market pre-COVID. We have another one where the multiple is really going to be higher than what we had projected, despite the company kind of suffering right now because of COVID. The fundamentals of it are still strong, and we're working through deal structure to kind of balance that off. But we haven't seen any real impact on valuation yet. And the attitude I've taken with my clients is there's no reason to panic.
Yeah.
There's still plenty of money out there. There's still active buyers. So if they want your company, if you've come through this reasonably well, why change your expectations at this point? So,
yeah, it's interesting something you said about taking care of the deal structure. That I'm curious because what I'm seeing is, and it may be consistent with that comment you made, is I'm seeing valuations holding as well in the industries that we deal in. I am seeing some changes in deal structures to, maybe shift some of the risk, to the seller, maybe more on an earnout or back end or, some contingencies or whatever. So it sounds like you're seeing the same thing.
We are, and we're seeing, a little bit more towards earnouts or seller notes, and then with some clawback provisions. Yeah. So I mean, if it's not an earnout per se, it's like, all right, if our EBITDA is within a certain range, we're fine. You know what? If it's within 10% or something, we're not going to care. But if not, then we're going to start to claw back against that seller note a little bit, which I think is a fair trade-off for both companies. Because as you know, your sellers want the cash at closing, and anything beyond that is a little bit at risk. And so if they take some risk with their note, I think they're comfortable with that. And if you're the buyer, well, you were going to kind of put that amount of cash into the deal anyway, so you're protect on the backside. So I like that structure and using the clawback versus some of the earnout methodology, because everyone goes, well, how am I going to get my earnout? What if I'm not running the company?
Right. I agree with you. And we've seen a lot of that same thing with clawbacks. And it's like, if the business hits its numbers, why wouldn't they pay full price on it? Right. And if it doesn't, they have a protection. So I agree. I don't know if the listeners know where you're located and whatever. So give them a little context of where you are, what type of businesses you deal with, and, where are you seeing the deals happening? Any particular industries?
We're in the Springfield, Massachusetts area, which we're basically half hour north of Hartford and 90 minutes west of Boston. So we're a very strong manufacturing market. A lot of precision aerospace is in this market, precision medical, things like that. So we deal a lot in that market with manufacturing, although we're agnostic. We do construction deals, we do professional services and technical services. But where we've been putting a lot of emphasis has been on the precision manufacturing side of it, because they're good, solid deals. There's an asset base. If you've got the right customer mix, they're very sticky for an acquirer. So they've been a good market to pursue. The only downside is that so many of them have been transacted over the years. There's fewer and fewer privately held ones to take the market.
Right. And it's interesting that area. I mean, unfortunately, like everything else these days, manufacturing has become political, conversation. So, not looking to go there. But my understanding, and you tell me just as a market, I mean, listen, traditional manufacturing, steel, coal, whatever, I don't care what anybody says, that's going to continue to go down. But this precision manufacturing and technical, and the medical, like all the stuff you're talking about, my understanding has been a growth area.
It has, because, there's a lot of that market was, our market's a great example of that. In the 60s and 70s, someone like a Pratt & Whitney or Hamilton Standard, they would spin off all these employees into their own little shops because they didn't want them in-house, and they would feed them work, and those guys would either grow or they would stay in that size. A lot of those guys have died off, or retired or whatever. So, but Pratt and Hamilton and GE, they still all have the same demand for machine parts. So there's a demand, there's a need. And the cost of capital to get in, because you're now buying 5-axis precision machines and everything else, has really made it harder for smaller shops to survive. So that's why you're seeing a lot of that transactional activity. It's like, oh, we can pull 3 or 4 of these shops together, and suddenly we've got $1 million EBITDA company versus, a couple $1.5 million, $2 million ones. And that's obviously worth a lot more from that aggregation standpoint.
Sure. Absolutely. What are some of the biggest mistakes that people make in trying to get deals done?
I think we could write a book on that one.
Absolutely. Yeah, you keep it to a few. We don't have like hours and hours.
I think there's always, and it's human nature, right, to put a higher value on what it's worth.
Yeah.
In the assumption of that value for someone like I talked to a guy last week had called and said, was telling me about his business, and he said, this is the number I want. And I said, well, how many employees, how much? It was just him, sole business, everything else. He's like, well, someone should pay me, $1 million in cash because of this. And I said, but you're no different than I am as a service provider, and he could never understand why another broker didn't want to take his deal on, right? So that mindset that our business is worth more than what it is because we've made a nice living at it is definitely a problem. Another one that I think is out there, and you'll appreciate this one, is how many bad attorneys there are in the choice of attorneys. I always tell my clients the first thing that you can do is make sure you pick a good attorney who knows commercial transactions.
Yeah.
Don't give me the guy who does a little bit of this and some real estate and some divorce work and everything else. He's going to get eaten alive by someone who knows what they're doing. And they're going to cost you a lot of money and probably cost you the deal.
Right. It's interesting. I feel like that's been a competitive advantage for us out there. And I actually say to, prospects when I get referred in on deals, I always say to them, listen, if you're not going to go with me, go with somebody like me. Just don't use your local guy, no matter how many years you've been, whatever, who handled your landlord tenant matter or even, did your small corporate work, like, your operating agreement, whatever. We do that stuff. We do contractual stuff, but there are attorneys who say they do M&A and maybe they've done a coffee shop deal here or there, but, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
The frustrating part for us, because, as soon as it gets into the attorney's hands, if they're not qualified, it just gets ugly. They're churning fees and missing things. So it's a big sticking point for us is who legal counsel is.
Yeah. Give us one more so we don't end on the lawyer comment.
I don't want to pick on lawyers. I think, there's the third side of it, which is the emotional side of it, right? Yeah. And again, it's not something you can blame them. It's a human nature what the business is, but they let that emotion sometimes just drive the transaction. And I've seen that on both sides, right? There's a seller, who just gets tied up to the most ridiculous, things that they need or they want that aren't rational. And I've also seen it on the buyer side where they just get so obsessed with getting the deal done that they lose sight of why they were doing the transaction and why it made sense. And now they're getting down into, an offer that doesn't make sense because they get obsessed with getting the deal done, like having the trophy.
It's interesting. I had that conversation actually this morning with a client on the seller side. One of the things that happens with sellers is that they have in their mind the deal's done way before it's done, right? And that may mean for them, whether it's, planning their next business, whether it's planning that trip around the world or that beach house they're going to buy or, playing golf 200 rounds a year or whatever it is for them, right? They already go there and psychologically they're there. And then, the deal evolves, there's due diligence, the terms are retraded or whatever it is. And there's a deal now on the table that they would have never taken up front, but they're so psychologically and emotionally invested in it that they keep going.
Or they've let the business kind of slide during that time.
Yeah.
You see that a lot. And, when you're dealing with deals that are tied to trailing 12-month EBITDAs and, or they start to see a little softness in the backlog, man, a smart buyer is going to pounce on those. So we try to educate our sellers about, don't take that foot off the pedal.
Yeah.
The other thing we try to educate them too is what's going to happen in due diligence. Yes. And it's kind of bizarre, but you don't know it until you experience it and how painful of a process it can be. We had a deal last year. There must have been, I think in my data room, there were probably 40 different people. Like the law firm alone was probably 25.
Right.
We had environmental people and IT people and HR people. And, why did the utility bill go up last July? I don't know. Maybe it was hotter than it was the July before, but those types of questions and just the overwhelming nature of it can eat you alive.
And one of the things that we've done, and it's true for any of the professionals, that has really, I think, helped facilitate our clients get deals done is, if you do have a good deal lawyer and, accountant and broker and all that stuff, they're going to know what and I'm talking about on the seller side, they're going to know what the buyer's going to be looking for, right? Because we've done this 1,000 times before, right? So what you want to do, folks, is you want to go through a pre-due diligence process with your professionals where you anticipate everything that, a buyer's going to ask for, even before you put the company on the market. And
definitely.
Yeah, and then you're set. I mean, I remember I did a deal for a company in the stock photography industry, sold out for like about $23 million some years back to a public company. And, we knew it was a public company. So, the due diligence is even going to be, even more stringent, right? And, we had them, and I made sure the other professionals do when they came in, and you got to understand, folks, if you don't on some of these, and not that 23 million is a huge deal, but, it's a medium-sized deal.
Yep.
They came in, they had like a dozen, 15 people, right, doing due diligence between legal and financial and whatever. And, they're looking for anything, whether it's, a missing signed key contract, which there's no problem in the relationship, but that's not up to date, to, issues in the financials or whatever. And you have to keep in mind that a lot of the people who are working on the deal, I'm not talking about the decision makers to buy, but I'm talking about the employees who are working on the deal, doing the due diligence from a buyer's side, that they're worried if they miss something and the deal goes bad after it's done, that their job's at stake, right? So they're looking for anything that could be a problem. And sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire, but sometimes where it seems like there's smoke, there is no fire. But the problem is if they think there's smoke, they're going to be worried there's fire and your deal's going to die. So you really want this to be buttoned up.
Well, it's funny, we had a new client that asked us, well, what could go wrong? When we're talking, you couldn't even explain. I said, I can tell you 100 things. It'll be the 101st. That will suddenly be this huge issue that you would never think in a million years. But some analyst somewhere or some guy is going to say, well, that's a problem. I said, so our job is to find as many of those as possible, but I can guarantee you there's still going to be one or two that are going to pop through that you're nuts that that's an issue. But to your point, someone is worried about it. Yeah,
and listen, some of them you have to react on the fly, but I also feel like the more buttoned up you are, the more like that, it just gives a buyer a comfort level. Oh, these guys, they're on top of their game, right? It just psychologically has them think there's less likelihood that there's a problem than, if you're missing signed addendums to a contract, or your financials are a little messed up, or you don't have technology licenses for some key, whatever it is, right? It just gets them worried.
We have a client right now that we've started with, they started the process mentally 5 years ago, started with his own data room, people to get his financials cleaned up and everything else. And he knew the number that he was going to get to from a revenue standpoint that was going to trigger the sale. So, you'd love to have every one of your sellers in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It makes it easy. And he's like, all right, what do I need to know? What am I missing? What am I, so they're great sellers that have a prepared one.
Love it. So before we conclude, I'm going to give you an opportunity to let people know where to find you and ask you my last question. Any last thoughts that you want to share with the audience on, any of this?
It's always a tricky question. I think if we're looking at the context of things right now is, be prepared. Yeah. If you're contemplating that exit, or even if you're not contemplating an exit, recognize that you're going to exit at some point. So, start that preparation process sooner rather than later. We always say to our clients, you never know when the bus is going to come. Be prepared for that bus to change your life quickly. So have the company in a good spot for it.
Love it. So, Michael, I'm sure people got a lot of value from this. If they want to find out more about you and your company, what's the best place for them to go?
So you can find us on the web at Vann, which is VANN-group.com. And you can also, if you want to check out the book, you can find it on Amazon, or you can find it on our website, buyingouttheboss.com.
Love it. All right. My final question of the podcast is always about my highest value, which is freedom. And for me, that is everything from freedom from all people in the world, from oppression to the reason I'm an entrepreneur, right? And I don't have a boss. So what does freedom mean to you, and how does it affect your business and life?
I think freedom to me is the ability to, two things. It's the ability to come and go, and then to have the financial wherewithal to make those things happen. So if you want to go and do something, you have the ability to do it. We're not talking crazy amounts of money, but just that comfort level that, if I don't work today, it's okay. And if we want to go do something a little bit different today, we can do it if we want to buy something. So to me, there's just a tremendous amount of stability that comes with knowing that from being self-employed, that you have control over, what you make and when you work. To me, that's a great freedom.
Love it. Michael Vann, thank you so much for being a guest on the DealQuest podcast.
Thanks for having me, Corey. It's been fun.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. I want to invite you to a unique way to tap into the wisdom and experience of the DealQuest community. Join the DealQuest Deal Den Zoom calls, a free monthly 90-minute mastermind. In the mastermind, we address all the challenges you may be facing and help support you with the opportunities that may arise in terms of deal-driven growth. You will get input not only from me, but all the members on the call will collaborate and serve each other in a mastermind format. To sign up for the free mastermind, go to www.corykupfer.com/dealden. That's corykupfer.com/dealden. I'll see you there. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.